Okay, today's video is going to be on the Crito, as today's reading. The Crito is a short but crucially important dialogue. I would like to share with you as well that it's one of the dialogues of Plato that has stayed with me the most over the years. It's one that comes to my mind at different moments of my life, and this may stick with you as well in the same sort of way. Now, normally a condemned person would be executed in the days immediately following the judgment. It is something of a happy accident that Socrates was kept in prison for 1 month before being executed. There was a tradition in Athens that a state galley would sail every year to Delos, an island in the Aegean, um, on a sacred mission which would normally last a few weeks. During this mission, no one could be executed according to Athenian law. The ship had left the day before the trial, and apparently due to contrary winds, it took a whole month this particular year. Let us note in passing that this is further evidence that Anytus did not intend to execute Socrates, because if such were his intentions, he would have had the trial at a different moment, and so as not to conflict with the sacred voyage. During this 1 month reprieve, Socrates was allowed to receive friends in his apartment, his prison apartment, and his friends lost no time in organizing his escape. Indeed, during the intervening month, the decision had become extremely unpopular in Athens itself, and in fact, all over Greece. People like Anytus were beginning to realize that there might be more than meets the eye with this eccentric who corrupts people and who, including his own son, remember, and who hangs around the marketplace. Socrates, in fact, had a type of fame that is typical of scholars. This is not a fame that should be confused with stardom. Scholars will be famous, but only among a small group of people. Their fame tends to last centuries, however, so we have heard of Socrates today, and we no longer know who Anytus is, except in this particular context. But for the Athenians of the day, of course, Socrates was the one who was unknown. Anytus was quite famous. To illustrate the kind of fame that Socrates has, let me give you an example. I'm reasonably confident who the most famous American of the late 20th century will be. No joke here. His name is Richard Feynman. Do not feel embarrassed if you do not know who Richard Feynman is. Nonetheless, I'm reasonably confident he is the most famous American of the late 20th century. He was a particle physicist who did some fantastic work and perhaps created the most successful theory in history. Now, Feynman could go to anywhere in the world and give a talk and fill up an auditorium. Yet his own next door neighbor probably had no idea who he was or whether or not he was somebody important or not. Socrates is famous in this sort of way. His fellow Athenians hardly know who he is, but he's famous throughout the Greek-speaking world. Now, there's only one, Anytus and the Athenian leaders at this point would actually be somewhat relieved if Socrates were to escape. It would basically save their political careers. If they go through the execution, they understand that their political careers are cooked, but they have no real way of getting out of carrying out the execution if Socrates doesn't escape. Now, the only snag in this escape plan, then, is Socrates. He has no intentions of escaping. And the Crito is about the reasons that lead him to decide to stay in his prison apartment and eventually accept the death penalty and drink the hemlock. On a different issue, I want to say a little bit more than I put in my notes on the issue of tacit consent. Some contemporary philosophers criticize the concept of tacit consent, the idea that we enter into an agreement to obey the laws merely by residing somewhere, by arguing that we simply do not have the actual mobility that would justify the principle. And they have a point. We may in principle be able to go elsewhere, but practically speaking, this is simply not in the cards for most of us. We don't have the financial means, we may lack the languages, and so forth. If you write on the topic or think through the topic in any context, remember, tacit consent implies that we are free to go elsewhere. If we are not, then this has become this principle has limited application. I might add, with having a double nationality, I feel very strongly the force of tacit consent. If I'm not happy with American laws, I can simply go to legally work pretty much anywhere in Western Europe, or vice versa. If I'm not happy with the laws of France, of course, I could come here. I sense the force very strongly. This sort of the force of tacit consent very strongly, but that's not available to everybody. On another issue, I want to say a little bit about my criticism of Socrates' moral philosophy. I think it's a very important component of any ethical philosophy, moral philosophy, is that you take into account transgenerational responsibility. We have responsibilities to our ancestors, and we have responsibilities to our descendants. I don't feel Socrates' moral philosophy embraces this sufficiently. Basically, I don't think his children are getting a fair deal by the way that Socrates argued during the trial. And it is extremely important that they do get a fair deal. This is a sort of compromising that we need to do. We have to compromise our ideals frequently when we have children. You may like taking a high moral stance, but it's not always an option. For example, if a boss treats you poorly and you're 20 years old and you're responsible to nobody else, you may decide to quit on the spur of the moment. Why not? It's up to you. On the other hand, if you have a spouse, if you have children, if you have a mortgage, and you have all these responsibilities, you can't do that. You have to, you may look for another job, but you're going to have to basically, bite your tongue and accept some things that you probably should not have to accept, but that's simply the way life is. Now, Socrates is not the only philosopher who has fallen short in this regard. I think the philosophy of Jean-Jacques Rousseau also has problems in this regard, as well as the contemporary popular thinker Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand has a lot of very interesting views, but if you read her famous books, Atlas Shrugged or The Fountainhead, you may note that there are neither children nor the elderly in those books, and yet they are massive books. And the reason is you can't put them in there. They simply don't fit into her ethical philosophy called ethical egoism. There's no way to incorporate this kind of transgenerational responsibility with her sort of contractual model. So it's an important touchstone when thinking about ethical philosophy. All right, enjoy reading the Credo.